Well, thank you for coming again to this presentation in which we're looking at the book of Nehemiah in the Old Testament. And those of you who may have had the opportunity to view the previous presentations may remember that what we're looking at is the background to Nehemiah's actually moving on to Jerusalem to rebuild or oversee the rebuilding of the ruined walls around the city of Jerusalem. And chapter 1 of Nehemiah tells us of that background, how that Nehemiah was serving in a provincial capital of the Babylonian Empire when his brother and others came to him, and he asked them about what was going on, and they gave him the information which was to Nehemiah very grim news. How that the walls of Jerusalem had been broken down, the gates burned, the whole city destroyed. And his response, as we considered last time, was quite moving. In Nehemiah chapter 1 verse 4 we read, "When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven." Nehemiah realised that those walls which were broken down weren't just a military defence for the city against invading armies, but they stood for something much more important. They stood for the identity, the separateness, the belongingness, if you like, of God's people. They were special in his sight, and those walls marked out that specialness before everyone else and indeed for themselves. And that's why it's important for us today to consider this account, because it points to our own sense of brokenness in terms of our own identity being very much bruised, battered, and even broken down, especially in these particular days when so many things we've depended upon and we've looked at as being a normal part of our lives, integral to who we are now no longer there or very much changed. So we may well identify with that sense of mourning and weeping and praying which Nehemiah felt when he heard the news of that broken state of the city. But he didn't stop there, because the chapter 1 of Nehemiah goes on to tell us how exactly Nehemiah prayed. And if you've got your Bibles, you might want to follow this through with me as I read it. This again is Nehemiah chapter 1, and we read from verse 5. "Then I said, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commands, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success by granting him favour in the presence of this man. I was cupbearer to the king." Now this prayer is really important, but the fact that Nehemiah prayed at all is really something we should note, because so often it's the case when we're facing difficulties and problems, when we're facing or trying to get our heads around the brokenness and how we can resolve it, that so often we turn to other sources of help as we may consider them to be. We try to get experts' opinion on what's going on, and specifically at this particular time, many people are listening avidly to the news and the medical experts. Now, we have to say that obviously these are very learned people. They are indeed qualified in their field, but we have to remember that although they are qualified and experienced, they do not have the last word. Their opinion is not necessarily what is actually happening or indeed going to happen. And that's why you and I need, whatever situations we may be facing, we need to come to God in prayer. Because it's when we are on our knees, either figuratively or literally, that we come to one who knows the answers, who is in control of what is going on, is aware of what is taking place in our own lives and the lives of those around us and this world in which we live. He is the one to whom we should turn. And that's exactly what Nehemiah did. Before he went off to Jerusalem or even considered that step, he prayed to God. And his prayer actually starts by reminding God, but actually he was reminding himself who God was. Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God. He was putting God in his place. He was reminding himself that God is Lord over all. But he's also going on to remind God, and especially to remind himself, that God is the God who is a covenant-keeping God. He loves his people and he wants his people to return to him, which is why Nehemiah was so keen, so ready to confess his failure and those of his people in order that he might have that ready access to God. And that's something we also need to consider, especially at this time, perhaps to reflect on our own failings, asking God to show us where we have moved away from his will and his presence, where we have depended upon ourselves and our own means of living our lives instead of referring to him and asking him to be Lord of our lives. But then in confession, Nehemiah then moved on to remind God of his promise, as it were, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. So in this praying, Nehemiah was very real and upfront with God about how Nehemiah saw himself, but also how much he was relying on God and what he said, which again is something we need to hold on to. Are we looking at the Bible? Are we reading and thinking through and meditating on what God has actually promised in the Bible? Because Nehemiah was very keen to pick up on this aspect of God wanting to bless his people. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant. Having previously talked about the fact that God promised that even if his people were exiled on the furthest part of the world, he would bring them back to the place he had chosen as an inheritance for his name. In other words, Jerusalem. And that inferred very much the need for those walls to be rebuilt. But Nehemiah was praying for a specific purpose. He was aiming at something. He was asking God finally, give your servant success by granting him favour in the presence of this man. And he had, almost as a postscript, almost as a throwaway comment, that he was cupbearer to the king. The king who just happened to be the king emperor of the Babylonian Empire, the most powerful man in the world at that time. That's where Nehemiah was serving, who he was serving. But he realised that actually coming to God first was necessary in order that he might be granted favour in the eyes of the king emperor, whose permission he was going to need in order to take any practical steps. But Nehemiah first of all prayed. And that's something that I would simply want to leave with each of us at this time. Are you and I praying? Are we turning to God? Thank you for listening.